There exists a moment in the dance between narcissist and empath when everything shifts. Not gradually, but with the sudden clarity of lightning illuminating a landscape you thought you knew. Carl Jung understood this moment as one of the most profound psychological awakenings possible, when the empath finally learns to speak the narcissist's true language. But this isn't the language of words. Words are just the surface ripples on a much deeper current of manipulation. The real language operates in silences, in the spaces between sentences, in the careful modulation of tone, and the strategic deployment of emotion. It's a dialect of control so sophisticated that most people spend years swimming in it without ever realizing they're drowning. Jung called this phenomenon shadow literacy, the ability to read the hidden grammar of psychological manipulation. And when an empath develops this literacy, something extraordinary happens. The spell breaks, not just temporarily, but permanently. Picture this moment in your own life. You finally decoded their silent treatments, their guilt trips, their charm offensives. You can predict their emotional weather patterns before the first cloud appears on their horizon. Most importantly, you've stopped reacting the way they expect. The hooks that once found easy purchase in your unguarded heart now bounce off harmlessly like arrows striking armor you didn't know you possessed. This is what Jung recognized as the recognition crisis, the moment when the narcissist realizes their primary tool of survival has become utterly ineffective. Their entire psychological structure depends on operating below the radar of conscious awareness. They need you to experience their manipulations as authentic emotions, not strategic behaviors. They require your unconscious participation in their drama. But consciousness, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. You cannot unknow what you now know about the architecture of their control. The pattern recognition becomes automatic, like learning to read. Once you see the letters forming words, you can't go back to seeing random marks on a page. Jung wrote that where love reigns, there is no will to power, and where the will to power is paramount, love is lacking. The narcissist operates entirely from will to power, which is why their relationships feel so exhausting. You're not connecting with a person. You're navigating a control system designed to extract your energy while giving nothing authentic in return. When you learn to decode this system, something profound shifts in your nervous system. You stop taking their behavior personally because you recognize it as mechanical. Their rage isn't about you. It's about losing control. Their charm isn't genuine attraction. It's strategic manipulation designed to reset your emotional baseline. Their silent treatment isn't hurt feelings. It's psychological punishment calibrated to bring you back into compliance. This recognition is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, becoming psychologically independent from others' unconscious patterns. But he also warned that this awakening comes with a cost. The narcissist won't simply accept your new awareness. They'll fight to reclaim the psychological territory they've lost. And that's where things become dangerous. The moment they sense you've learned their language is the moment they realize their fundamental strategy for existing in the world has been compromised. It's not just about losing you. It's about losing their ability to maintain the carefully constructed self-image that protects them from their deepest shame. You've become a mirror reflecting back their true nature, and Jung understood that most narcissists would rather destroy the mirror than face what it shows them. Jung spent decades studying what he called psychological projections, and he discovered that narcissists operate through a specific linguistic code that most people never consciously recognize. What I call the manipulation grammar, a systematic way of controlling reality through language, emotion, and strategic behavior. This grammar follows predictable rules once you know how to read them. When they say, "You're being too sensitive," they're really communicating, Stop responding to my manipulation in ways that make me look bad. The word sensitive becomes a weapon designed to make you question your own perceptions. They're not commenting on your emotional state. They're attempting to gaslight you into doubting your reality. When they deploy the silent treatment, they're not expressing hurt feelings. They're implementing a calculated strategy that says, "I'm withdrawing my approval until you submit to my control." Dark silence becomes a form of emotional terrorism designed to activate your abandonment fears and bring you crawling back with apologies for crimes you didn't commit. When they suddenly shower you with affection after mistreating you, they're not expressing genuine love. They're communicating, "I need to reset your nervous system so you'll tolerate more abuse." This love bombing serves a specific neurological function. It creates trauma bonding by alternating pain and relief, making you addicted to the very source of your suffering. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But narcissists don't allow genuine transformation. They create what I call false chemistry. Reactions that seem intimate, but are actually calculated to produce specific responses in you. Every hot and cold cycle serves the same function, maintaining psychological control. Every guilt trip is designed to activate your shame. Every rage outburst is calculated to make you responsible for managing their emotional state. Even their vulnerability when it appears is often strategic. A carefully timed revelation designed to hook your empathy just when you're considering leaving. The moment you learn to translate their behavior instead of just experiencing it, everything changes. You stop feeling crazy because their contradictions start making perfect sense. They're not contradictory at all. They're strategic. The chaos that once overwhelmed you reveals itself as a carefully orchestrated symphony of control. But here's where Jung's insight becomes crucial learning. This language doesn't just protect you from them. It forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself. Why were you susceptible to this manipulation in the first place? What psychological wounds made you vulnerable to their control strategies? Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness isn't just in the narcissist. It's in the parts of yourself that needed their approval, feared their abandonment, or mistook intensity for intimacy. Maybe you discover you have unhealed abandonment wounds that made you cling to anyone who showed you attention, even negative attention. Maybe you recognize a savior complex that made you believe you could love someone into health. Maybe you see codependent patterns that made you confuse enmeshment with intimacy. This is why learning the narcissist's language is so transformative. You're not just decoding their manipulations. You're discovering your own psychological blueprint. The wounds that made you an easy target, the needs that made you vulnerable, the fears that kept you trapped in a dynamic that was slowly destroying your sense of self. Jung understood that when an empath becomes conscious of these patterns, it creates what I call the recognition crisis for the narcissist. Their entire psychological structure depends on your unconscious participation. They need you to react emotionally to their provocations, to chase them during their withdrawals, to accept responsibility for their projections. When you stop playing these roles, something extraordinary happens. You become a living demonstration that their reality is not the only reality. Your calm in the face of their storm exposes the manufactured nature of their chaos. Your boundaries in the face of their demands reveal the optional nature of their control. This is why they react so violently when they sense you've learned their language. It's not just about losing control over you. It's about losing their ability to control their own self-image. As long as you reacted unconsciously to their manipulations, they could tell themselves they were just being emotional, just having relationship difficulties, just misunderstood. But when you respond with calm awareness to their rage, when you don't chase them during their silent treatments, when you don't get hooked by their guilt trips, You become a mirror reflecting back their true nature. And Jung understood that this reflection is often unbearable for someone whose entire identity is built on avoiding their authentic self. Jung observed that when someone learns to recognize psychological manipulation clearly, they trigger what I call control system collapse in the manipulator. The narcissist experiences something they've never had to face: the complete ineffectiveness of their primary coping mechanisms. This creates a profound crisis for them, because their entire identity is built on their ability to control others' perceptions and reactions. Jung wrote that the world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, the world will tell you. The narcissist has always let their effect on others tell them who they are. When that effect disappears, they face an identity void that feels like psychological annihilation. Imagine spending your entire life believing you're a master chess player, only to discover that your opponent has been letting you win. That's the existential shock the narcissist experiences when they realize you've learned their language. Their sense of superiority, their feeling of control, their entire self-concept has been built on an illusion that you were unconsciously helping to maintain. Their escalation in response to your awareness isn't random. It follows a predictable pattern Jung identified in his work on shadow projection. First comes escalation, proper, bigger manipulations, more extreme behaviors, desperate attempts to pull you back into the familiar dance of chaos and control. They might threaten suicide to activate your guilt. They might rage with unprecedented intensity to intimidate you back into compliance. They might attempt to destroy things you value to punish you for your independence. This isn't them becoming worse people. It's them revealing how desperate they've always been to maintain control. You might notice this escalation feels different from their previous manipulations. There's a quality of desperation to it, a frantic energy that wasn't there before. Where their previous tactics felt calculated and controlled, these feel increasingly wild and unpredictable. They're no longer operating from a position of strength. They're fighting for their psychological survival. Next comes what I call false enlightenment. Sudden claims of self-awareness, promises to change, temporary improvements designed to regain your trust. They might enter therapy and report back on their insights. They might apologize with seemingly unprecedented depth. They might acknowledge their patterns with startling accuracy. But Jung would warn you to observe their behavior, not their words. True transformation is a slow, often invisible process of internal work. False enlightenment is a performance designed to manipulate your hope. The difference is that genuine change doesn't require an audience, while false enlightenment always needs witnesses to its supposed transformation. During this phase, they might say things like, "I've been reading about narcissism, and I think I might have some tendencies." Or, "My therapist says I have trust issues from my childhood." They're using psychological language as a new form of manipulation, hoping that their apparent self-awareness will convince you to give them another chance. The key is to watch what they do, not what they say. Does their behavior actually change? Or do they just talk about changing? Do they take responsibility without making excuses? Or do they use their newfound insights to justify their past behavior? Do they respect your boundaries during this phase? Or do they use their supposed growth as another way to push past your limits? Then comes replacement shopping. The frantic search for someone new to control, often while trying to make you jealous or feel you've been easily replaced. This phase reveals the truth about what you meant to them. You weren't a beloved individual, you were a function, and functions can be replaced with anyone willing to perform the same role. The speed with which they move on can be shocking and hurtful. One day they're declaring their undying love, and promising to change the next, they're posting pictures with someone new, seemingly happier than they ever were with you. This isn't evidence that you weren't special. It's evidence that they were never capable of seeing your specialness in the first place. Jung understood that this rapid replacement serves multiple functions. It's partly about finding new sources of supply, partly about punishing you for leaving, and partly about proving to themselves that they don't need you. The underlying message is, see, I'm fine without you. You weren't as important as you thought. But if you understand the pattern, you can see this replacement for what it really is, a desperate attempt to fill the void that your absence has created. They're not replacing you with someone better. They're replacing you with someone who hasn't yet learned their language. Finally comes reality distortion, the systematic rewriting of history to make themselves the victim. They'll spread lies about you to others, create elaborate narratives where you're the abuser, and recruit flying monkeys to carry their version of events. Jung called this projection the unconscious transfer of their own qualities onto others. This phase can be particularly difficult because it attacks your reputation and relationships with others. They might tell people you were controlling, abusive, or unstable. They might share private information about you to make you look bad. They might play the victim so convincingly that others actually feel sorry for them. The reality distortion serves several purposes. It helps them avoid accountability for their behavior, maintains their image as the wronged party, and potentially isolates you from sources of support. Most importantly, it allows them to maintain their internal narrative that they are good and you are bad. But here's what Jung understood about this process that changes everything. And their behavior during this crisis isn't about you. It's about their desperate attempt to avoid confronting their authentic self. Every escalation tactic is a strategy to avoid the mirror you've become. Every lie they tell about you is a truth they can't bear to face about themselves. Jung wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. The narcissists' collapse when they lose control isn't proof that you're hurting them. It's proof that you're no longer allowing them to hurt you. Their attempts to replace you aren't evidence of your inadequacy. They're evidence of their inability to exist without someone to control. Understanding this pattern protects you from taking their reactions personally. Their rage isn't really about your behavior. It's about the existential terror of being seen clearly and found wanting. Their smear campaign isn't about your character. It's about their need to maintain the fiction that their version of reality is the only valid one. Their desperate search for replacement supply isn't about your replaceability. It's about their terror of being alone with themselves. They need someone to control, not because they're strong, but because they're weak. They need someone to manipulate, not because they're clever, but because they're afraid of genuine connection. Your immunity to their language has forced them into what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a confrontation with their shadow that they've spent their entire lives avoiding. But while this might sound cruel, it's actually the only chance they have for genuine healing if they choose to take it. Most won't choose healing. The fortress they've built around their wounded core is too comfortable, too familiar. They'll find new sources of supply, new people to control, new stages on which to perform their drama. But your refusal to participate creates a crack in their reality that can never be fully sealed. Some part of them will always remember the person who saw through their masks and chose not to react with either fear or pity, but with clear-eyed awareness. This memory, however buried, carries the seed of their potential transformation. Whether it grows is not your responsibility to determine. The psychological collapse you witness isn't your fault, and it's not your responsibility to fix. It's the natural consequence of a psychological structure that was always unsustainable. Their entire way of being in the world was dependent on finding people who would unconsciously participate in their drama. When you stop participating, the drama collapses. Jung understood that this collapse, while painful to witness, is sometimes necessary for genuine transformation to occur. But he also understood that most people will choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar growth. Your role is not to force their healing or prevent their collapse. It's to maintain your own center while they face the consequences of their choices. Your work now is tending your own ground, ensuring that the soil of your psyche is no longer fertile for the weeds of manipulation. You've learned their language not to become fluent in cruelty, but to develop immunity to its effects. This immunity is your gift to yourself and everyone who will know you going forward. The narcissist's psychological collapse, when they realize you've learned their language, is ultimately not about you. It's about them finally being forced to face themselves without the distraction of controlling someone else. This confrontation with their authentic self is the only path to genuine healing, even though most will choose to avoid it by finding new people to manipulate instead. But there's something deeper happening during this collapse that Jung would want you to understand. The narcissist isn't just losing their ability to control you. They're losing their primary defense against their own inner emptiness. For years, maybe decades, they've avoided feeling their authentic emotions by staying busy managing yours. Your emotional reactions were their drug of choice. Your confusion gave them clarity. Your chaos gave them control. Your pain gave them power. When you stop providing these reactions, they're forced to sit alone with feelings they've spent a lifetime avoiding. This is why their desperation becomes so intense. They're not just fighting to get you back. They're fighting to avoid a confrontation with their own soul that feels like death itself. The rage, the threats, the promises, the replacement shopping, all of it is elaborate avoidance of the simple, terrifying task of being alone with themselves. Jung understood that this avoidance of authentic feeling is what creates the narcissistic personality in the first place. Somewhere in their early development, they learned that their genuine emotions were unacceptable, dangerous, or simply invisible to the people who were supposed to care for them. So they built an elaborate false self designed to get needs met that their authentic self could not. The problem is that the false self, no matter how sophisticated, can never actually receive the love validation or connection it seeks. It's like trying to feed a photograph. The image might look hungry, but it cannot actually consume nourishment. This is why no amount of supply ever satisfies them for long. They're trying to fill a real need with false food. When you learn their language and stop participating in their drama, you force them to confront this fundamental contradiction in their existence. They must either begin the painful work of dismantling their false self and learning to live authentically, or they must find new sources of distraction through new relationships. The vast majority choose distraction. It's simply too terrifying to face the accumulated pain of a lifetime, to feel the grief of all the authentic connections they've sacrificed for control, to experience the shame of how they've treated people who genuinely cared about them. But for those rare few who choose healing, your refusal to enable their dysfunction becomes the catalyst for their transformation. Your boundaries become the container that forces them to face themselves. Your clarity becomes the mirror that shows them who they really are beneath the masks. This is why Jung emphasized that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone is to stop participating in their unconscious patterns. By refusing to be manipulated, you create the possibility for genuine relationship. By maintaining your boundaries, you demonstrate what real love looks like. By staying centered in yourself, you model what emotional maturity means. The narcissist's collapse is not your responsibility to prevent or fix. It's the natural consequence of a life built on illusion, meeting the immovable force of reality. Your role is to maintain your own integrity while they navigate the consequences of their choices. Develop immunity to its effects. This immunity is your gift to yourself and everyone who will know you going forward. Jung discovered something paradoxical about psychological freedom, and the moment you no longer need to understand someone's manipulation tactics is the moment you've truly mastered them. What I call the freedom paradox. You gain immunity to narcissistic abuse by becoming indifferent to understanding it. This represents a profound shift in consciousness. Instead of constantly analyzing their behavior, predicting their moves, or preparing for their tactics, you simply stop caring what they do. Not because you've become cold or uncaring, but because you've become centered in yourself. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. When you're secure in your authentic identity, others' attempts to manipulate that identity lose all power. You're no longer seeking validation from them, fearing their abandonment, or needing their approval. This creates what I call psychological invulnerability. Not because you can't be hurt, but because you're no longer vulnerable to their specific type of harm. Their silent treatments can't punish you if you genuinely enjoy solitude. Their guilt trips can't control you if you're comfortable disappointing them. Their rage can't intimidate you if you're not afraid of their emotions. But here's where the freedom becomes challenging. You may find yourself grieving the connection you thought you had. Jung understood that even toxic relationships provide a form of intensity that can feel like aliveness. The constant drama, the emotional roller coaster, the high-stakes nature of every interaction. These create an addictive quality that healthy relationships often lack. When you step out of the chaos, life might initially feel quiet, empty, or boring. Jung wrote that the most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. But this calm is your natural state. After years of artificial stimulation through crisis, peace can feel strange. You might even find yourself missing the emotional extremes and the feeling of being needed, even if toxically, the sense that your love could save someone. This is why many empaths cycle back into narcissistic relationships. They mistake peace for emptiness, drama for passion, chaos for connection. Jung would say, this is the final test of your liberation. Can you tolerate the quiet joy of healthy relationships after the addictive intensity of toxic ones? Can you find aliveness in stability rather than crisis? Can you value consistency over excitement? The freedom paradox means accepting that healthy love feels different from traumatic bonding. It's steadier but less dramatic, more peaceful but less urgent, more authentic but less intense. It requires learning to find fulfillment in relationships that nourish rather than drain, that build rather than destroy, that honor your authentic self rather than demanding its sacrifice. This transformation involves developing what Jung called the union of opposites. The ability to hold contradictory truths without being torn apart by them. For empaths recovering from narcissistic abuse, this means integrating both your capacity for deep empathy and your need for strong boundaries. This integration creates conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others without losing yourself in their experience. You can recognize someone's pain without feeling responsible for fixing it. You can understand someone's behavior without excusing their impact. You can have compassion without sacrificing self-protection. Jung wrote that the acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life. This acceptance includes acknowledging the parts of yourself that were vulnerable to manipulation. Not to shame yourself, but to heal those wounds consciously. The integrated empath develops what Jung called active imagination, the ability to consciously engage with your own psychological patterns instead of being unconsciously controlled by them. When you feel the old urge to fix someone, you can recognize it as a trauma response rather than genuine care. When you feel attracted to chaotic intensity, you can identify it as familiar dysfunction rather than true connection. This consciousness allows you to make different choices. You can feel the pull of old patterns without being controlled by them. You can recognize manipulation without needing to confront it. You can have boundaries without becoming rigid or closed off. Jung understood that this level of integration is rare because it requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. You must be strong enough to protect yourself while remaining open enough for genuine connection, discerning enough to recognize manipulation, while compassionate enough to understand the wounds behind it. The mastery isn't about becoming invulnerable. It's about becoming consciously vulnerable only with people who've earned that trust through consistent, healthy behavior. You learn to evaluate people's actions while maintaining compassion for their struggles. You can set boundaries with someone without needing to demonize them. You can protect yourself without becoming defensive or reactive. This is emotional maturity, the ability to be fully yourself while allowing others to be fully themselves, even when those selves are incompatible with your well-being. Your freedom lies not in controlling others' behavior, but in consciously choosing your responses to it. But there's a deeper layer to this freedom that Jung would want you to understand. The ability to witness your own psychological patterns without being consumed by them. You begin to notice when you're falling into old habits of thought, old patterns of emotional reactivity, old ways of seeking external validation. And instead of judging yourself harshly for these moments, you observe them with gentle curiosity. This observer consciousness is what separates the truly free from those who simply trade one form of reactivity for another. You're not trying to become perfect or eliminate all emotional responses. You're developing the capacity to choose your responses consciously rather than being driven by unconscious compulsions. Jung understood that this level of self-awareness transforms not just your relationships with others, but your relationship with yourself. You stop being your own worst critic and become your own most compassionate witness. You learn to speak to yourself with the same kindness you would offer a beloved friend facing similar struggles. This internal shift creates what I call authentic self-compassion. Not the kind that makes excuses for harmful behavior, but the kind that recognizes your humanity while still holding yourself accountable for growth. You can acknowledge your mistakes without drowning in shame. You can recognize your limitations without feeling fundamentally flawed. When you develop this kind of relationship with yourself, the opinions of others naturally become less important. Not because you don't care about people, but because your primary source of validation comes from within. You're no longer constantly seeking mirrors in other people's eyes to tell you who you are. This is perhaps the most profound aspect of the freedom paradox. The moment you stop needing others to complete you is the moment you become capable of truly connecting with them. Your relationships transform from transactions based on need to exchanges, based on genuine appreciation and choice. Jung believed this represents the highest form of psychological development. Becoming so secure in your own identity that you can love freely without possessiveness, give without keeping score, and receive without feeling indebted. This is freedom not from relationship, but freedom within relationship. Jung observed that individual psychological healing creates collective transformation. When you become immune to manipulation, you don't just protect yourself. You model what authentic strength looks like for everyone around you. What I call the authenticity ripple. Your healing gives others permission to heal too. People notice when you stop participating in toxic dynamics. They see that you can be kind without being weak, that you can have boundaries without being cruel, that you can be empathetic without being exploitable. This challenges their unconscious assumptions about what relationships should look like. Jung wrote that everyone you meet knows something you don't know, but need to know. But the reverse is also true. Everyone you meet can learn something from your journey towards psychological freedom. Your refusal to engage with manipulation shows others that they don't have to engage with it either. Children especially benefit from witnessing adults who don't accept abusive behavior. Instead of learning that love requires sacrifice of self, they see that healthy love enhances both people. They learn that boundaries are acts of self-care, not selfishness. They discover that manipulation isn't normal. It's a sign of dysfunction. Your workplace culture shifts when you stop enabling others' manipulative behaviors. You demonstrate that competence doesn't require tolerating abuse, that professionalism can include emotional boundaries, that success doesn't depend on sacrificing your mental health. Even casual interactions transform when you operate from this new consciousness. You stop making excuses for people's poor behavior. You don't automatically assume responsibility for others' emotions. You respond to manipulation with calm clarity rather than reactive defensiveness. Jung understood that society heals one conscious individual at a time. Each person who refuses to participate in unconscious patterns creates space for others to make healthier choices. Your immunity to the narcissist's language becomes a gift to everyone who interacts with you. But Jung also warned that this transformation can be isolating. When you stop participating in collective unconsciousness, you might feel different from others who are still operating from old patterns. This loneliness is temporary. As you heal, you attract others who are also committed to conscious living. The most profound ripple effect is what I call energy signature change. Your entire energetic presence shifts from reactive to responsive, from defensive to grounded, from needy to whole. This attracts completely different people into your life, while naturally repelling those who need someone to manipulate. Jung understood that learning the narcissist's language is just the beginning of a much larger journey towards psychological sovereignty. What matters isn't just recognizing manipulation, it's consistently choosing conscious responses over unconscious reactions. This consciousness requires daily practice. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to choose authenticity over people-pleasing, truth over peacekeeping, self-protection over self-sacrifice. These might seem like small choices, but Jung knew that transformation happens through accumulating moments of conscious decision-making. Jung wrote, "You are what you do not, what you say you'll do." Your recovery becomes real through consistent action, not through understanding or insight alone. Each time you maintain a boundary despite pressure, each time you refuse to engage with manipulation, each time you choose your well-being over someone else's comfort, you strengthen your psychological immunity. The conscious choice also means accepting that some people will never appreciate your growth. Those who benefited from your old patterns, your people-pleasing, your emotional management, your willingness to accept blame, may resist your transformation. Jung would say this resistance is information about the health of those relationships. Healthy people celebrate your boundaries because they make authentic connection possible. Unhealthy people resist your boundaries because they make exploitation impossible. Your growth becomes a sorting mechanism, naturally filtering out those who were never truly supportive of your well-being. But this sorting process requires emotional maturity and discernment. Not everyone who struggles with your new boundaries is necessarily toxic. Some people may simply be accustomed to the old dynamic and need time to adjust. The key is observing whether they make genuine efforts to respect your changes or whether they persistently try to undermine your growth. Jung understood the difference between those who resist change because it's uncomfortable and those who resist it because it threatens their ability to exploit you. The former will eventually adapt and may even thank you for helping them grow. The latter will escalate their tactics or eventually exit your life, revealing that their connection to you was always conditional on your willingness to be diminished. This realization can be heartbreaking, especially when it involves family members or long-term friends. You may discover that relationships you thought were built on love were actually built on function. Your function as caretaker, rescuer, scapegoat, or emotional regulator. When you stop performing these functions, the relationship reveals its true foundation. Jung wrote that in all chaos, there is a cosmos, in all disorder, a secret order. The chaos of narcissistic relationships often contains the seeds of your own liberation. The manipulation that once controlled you becomes the teacher that shows you exactly where your psychological work needs to focus. Every boundary violation taught you where boundaries needed to be strengthened. Every instance of gaslighting showed you where you needed to trust your own perceptions more deeply. Every moment of being made responsible for someone else's emotions revealed where you needed to distinguish between empathy and codependence. But this learning comes with responsibility. Once you understand these patterns, you can't claim ignorance when you see them in other relationships. You become accountable for protecting yourself and others from manipulation to the extent that you're able. This doesn't mean becoming the rescuer again or trying to save others from their own unconscious patterns. It means using your hard-won wisdom to create healthier connections rather than returning to familiar dysfunction. It means trusting the quiet steadiness of authentic love rather than the addictive intensity of traumatic bonding. It means believing you deserve relationships based on mutual respect rather than mutual need. Jung believed this consciousness represents human evolution. The development of individuals who can love without losing themselves, connect without compromising their essence, and care without carrying what doesn't belong to them. Your journey from unconscious participation in toxic patterns to conscious choice in healthy ones contributes to this evolutionary process. The ripple effect of your transformation extends beyond your immediate relationships into the broader cultural conversation about what healthy connection looks like. When you model that love doesn't require self-sacrifice, you challenge cultural narratives that romanticize dysfunction. When you demonstrate that boundaries strengthen rather than weaken relationships, you offer an alternative to the codependent patterns that pervade so many cultural messages about love and loyalty. Your healing becomes part of a larger movement toward conscious relationship, where people choose each other from wholeness rather than neediness, where conflicts lead to growth rather than destruction, where differences are celebrated rather than attacked. You contribute to this movement not through activism or advocacy, but through the simple act of living differently. Jung understood that the most powerful form of teaching is embodiment. When you consistently choose consciousness over reactivity, authenticity over performance, self-respect over people-pleasing, you create a template that others can follow. You demonstrate that another way of being in relationship is possible. This teaching happens organically through the quality of presence you bring to every interaction. People sense something different about you, a quality of centered strength, of peaceful confidence, of genuine care that doesn't demand anything in return. They may not be able to articulate what it is, but they feel it. Some will be inspired by your example and begin their own journey toward greater consciousness. Others may feel threatened by your authenticity and try to pull you back into familiar patterns. Your task is to remain steadfast in your commitment to growth while maintaining compassion for those who aren't ready for their own transformation. The ultimate ripple effect of learning the narcissist's language is the development of what Jung called individual ethical responsibility. The recognition that you are accountable for your own psychological development and the impact it has on the collective human experience. When the narcissist realizes the empath has learned their language, they're not just losing control over one person. They're confronting the possibility that their entire approach to relationships is fundamentally flawed. But your awakening isn't about them anymore. It's about you reclaiming the psychological territory that was always yours. Jung wrote that the greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. You cannot solve the narcissist. You cannot fix the manipulation. You cannot change the dynamics by becoming more skilled at their language. You can only outgrow your need to participate in these patterns. Your journey from unconscious victim to conscious observer to integrated individual represents what Jung called the individuation process, becoming who you truly are beneath all the conditioning, trauma, and adaptation. This process serves not only your own healing, but the healing of the collective human psyche. Every person who breaks free from unconscious patterns, who chooses consciousness over reactivity, who develops the capacity for authentic relationship, contributes to the evolution of human consciousness. Your individual healing becomes part of humanity's larger journey towards psychological maturity. The narcissist inadvertently became your teacher by showing you exactly which psychological wounds needed healing. Their language, the manipulation, the control, the emotional terrorism, forced you to develop fluency in something far more valuable, the language of your own authenticity. You learned to recognize your real feelings beneath their projections. You discovered your genuine needs beneath their demands. You found your actual voice beneath their silencing. This is why learning their language ultimately sets you free. Not because you can manipulate them back, but because you can finally hear yourself clearly. The noise of their chaos no longer drowns out the quiet wisdom of your inner guidance. Every silent treatment taught you to value your own company. Every guilt trip showed you where your boundaries needed strengthening. Every manipulation revealed another way you were abandoning yourself for their approval. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. Learning their language wasn't about becoming like them. It was about becoming immune to what they represent, the unconscious patterns that keep people trapped in cycles of manipulation and control. You are now fluent in freedom, and that language no one can take from you. When you speak it, others recognize its authenticity. When you live it, you give permission for others to find their own freedom. And when you embody it fully, you become living proof that consciousness can triumph over unconsciousness, that healing can overcome wounding, and that the individual journey toward wholeness serves the healing of all. This is Jung's greatest gift to understanding human relationships, the recognition that every encounter with another's shadow is an opportunity to integrate your own. The narcissist who tried to diminish you ultimately became the catalyst for your expansion. And that perhaps is the most profound freedom of all. But the story doesn't end with your liberation. Your freedom creates what Jung called a field of possibility around you, an energetic space where others can glimpse their own potential for consciousness and healing. Your presence becomes an invitation for others to step into their own authenticity, to trust their own perceptions, to honor their own needs. You discover that true power lies not in controlling others, but in mastering yourself. Not in being needed, but in being whole. Not in fixing what is broken in others, but in celebrating what is beautiful in yourself and everyone you encounter. This is the language of freedom. And once you learn it, you can never forget how to speak it. Your journey continues not as someone fleeing from toxicity, but as someone moving toward ever greater levels of consciousness, authenticity, and love. The narcissist's language becomes a memory, a skill you once needed to survive, but no longer need to define you. You carry the wisdom without carrying the wounds, the understanding, without the entanglement, the compassion, without the confusion. This is what it means to truly learn their language, and then transcend the need to speak it. You become fluent in something far more powerful, the language of your own soul, speaking its truth with quiet confidence, creating ripples of healing that extend far beyond what you can see or imagine. In learning to decode their manipulation, you learn to encode your own liberation. In refusing to be diminished by their shadow, you learn to shine with your own light. In stepping away from their chaos, you learn to dance to the rhythm of your own authentic being. This is your gift to the world, not the ability to recognize toxicity, but the capacity to embody health. Not the skill to defend against manipulation, but the strength to create genuine connection. Not the knowledge of how to survive dysfunction, but the wisdom of how to thrive in authentic relationship with yourself and others. The narcissist's realization that you have learned their language marks not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of your life as a truly sovereign being, creating from wholeness, rather than healing from brokenness, choosing from freedom rather than reacting from fear. And in this beginning, you discover that the greatest victory is not defeating your adversary, but becoming so centered in your own truth that adversaries become irrelevant. This is the ultimate freedom, not needing to fight the darkness because you have become a source of light.